us for Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar, which is focused on discussing Turkey's response to the Hamas attacks of October 7th and everything that has happened in the subsequent almost 4 weeks now. I'm Blaise Michdal, the Vice President of Policy for JINSA. I'm delighted to be joined by two very esteemed and expert guests, Ambassador Eric Edelman, who is, of course, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, among many other senior postings, and is now a counselor here at JINSA and the co-chair of our Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project, and Alan Makovsky, who is the eminence grise and the dean of Turkish studies here in Washington, D.C., a longtime State Department and House staffer, now a member of JINSA's Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project, as well as a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. I want to thank you both for joining me. We've been talking a lot in recent webinars here at JINSA, obviously about the conflict itself and what is happening in Israel and in Gaza. But the international response has also been an important part of the story. And Turkey's response in particular has been a very interesting one, and feels like one that has maybe evolved over time from some of what we heard from President Erdogan immediately after the October 7th attack, to the more strident language that we heard last weekend at the big rally in Turkey. So I wanted to ask you both, maybe to begin with, if you could choose one word to characterize Turkey's response, what would it be? And then maybe we can talk about how it has changed a little bit. But Ambassador Edelman, starting with you.
Well, I'm sorry to say that I think the one word I would use is unsurprising. I think Recep Tayyip Erdogan is marked deeply by his Islamist roots. I think he has a great deal of difficulty getting away from that. I certainly saw that when I was ambassador almost 20 years ago now, at the beginning of his tenure. And I think, his, particularly the strident remarks at the Palestine rally, but really what he said both before and since then are of a piece with what he has, consistently said about Israel's policies in both Gaza and in the West Bank. I mean, it's not very balanced, and it's very emotional and not always very well reasoned.
Alan, what about you? Were you surprised? Would you have a different description?
I would have to agree very much with Ambassador Edelman. I think what we've heard from Erdogan is very much who the man is. I mean, we know his background. If he's not a card-carrying member of the Muslim Brotherhood, he's certainly its most enthusiastic fellow traveler. And he did try to restrain himself at the beginning, but once Israel responded, it was Katie barred the door in terms of his rhetoric. And we've at the beginning, I don't want to give him too much credit. At the beginning, he never blamed Hamas by name. He never called what happened terrorism. He did not call for unilateral release of the hostages. He went so far, which for him is something. He went so far as to say that he was against the killing of civilians on Israeli territory, which is about as far as I've ever heard him go. But once Israel responded, of course, he has unleashed a barrage of pro-Hamas rhetoric, describing Hamas as liberators and as a resistance organization that's just trying to protect its own territory, and as mujahids, fighters for the faith. And of course, he has attacked Israel, accused it of crimes against humanity, which he said he's going, and it's a project he's going to work on, implying that perhaps he's going to try to lodge a case somewhere. And of course, I think in many ways, the most disturbing thing from a US point of view is what he had to say after we sent our initial carrier group to the Mediterranean. When he said that we had sent it there to create massacres in Gaza. And that's kind of shocking language, even coming from an enemy, but from an ally, it's, well, there's only one ally who would use language like that. So,
yeah, I mean, just to add to what Alan just said, Blaise, I would note that the rhetoric, at the Palestine rally was not just, anti-Israeli, but very anti-Western and very anti-American, blaming the United States, for what was going on in Gaza. So, there you have it.
So maybe, Alan, you could set the scene for us a little bit about this pro-Palestine rally that happened last weekend in Turkey, because it wasn't just a pro-Palestine rally. I mean, there was a significance to the date and sort of why Erdogan wanted a big rally last weekend in particular.
Right. Well, it was on October 28th, which was one day before the 100th anniversary of the Turkish Republic, where people, I think, had been expecting, or at least some time ago, had been expecting that Turkey would have a gala celebration. Instead, the Palestine rally totally overshadowed the 100th anniversary. And it was, many secularists perceived it, and I think it's hard to argue otherwise, as Erdogan's effort really to detract from Ataturk and from the secular nature of the Republic, to diminish the Republic because of its secularism. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up. As Eric said, there was a lot of heated rhetoric, and much of it directed against the United States and the West, which he said were the enablers of Israel.
So I guess one of the
And by the way, Blair, I'll just add, the 100th anniversary itself turned out to be a fizzle. And I have to say, as an older guy who remembers Turkey's 75th anniversary, there was a lot of hoopla. It had its own logo. There was Turkey invited dignitaries. I believe several heads of state came to help Turkey celebrate. There was none of this with the 100th anniversary, the centennial, which one would have thought would have been a time of great jubilation.
It's interesting to speculate to what Alan was just saying. What would have happened on the 30th had there not been the events of October 7th, right? Which allowed Erdogan to have this other event that eclipsed clearly the centenary. I have the sense that he wasn't anxious to celebrate it in any event. I think he clearly fancies himself, I would argue, as the leader of essentially a counter-revolution. If you think of Ataturk's establishment of the Turkish Republic as a revolution, which it certainly was. If you think of the great revolutions of the 20th century, you think of Lenin, you think of Mao, you think of Fidel Castro, but Ataturk's revolution was in many ways as significant as those, and it's been pretty clear for a while that Erdogan sees himself as somehow superseding Ataturk and creating a new Turkey that is moving away from the secular principles that Ataturk embraced. I don't think he's been able to actually accomplish that. I think Turkey remains deeply divided, and some of what Erdogan has done here and is doing, and some of the rhetoric, I think, is related to his own political project, and in particular, since Turkey remains such a divided society, for electoral purposes, he always has to try and mobilize his base. And this kind of rhetoric, with municipal elections coming up next spring, is very, very useful for mobilizing the base, rallying the base, and setting the stage for, electoral victory. I think in his mind, taking back those cities that were lost in the 2019 municipal election that collectively, and Alan will correct me here if I get this wrong, but collectively represent about 70% of the productive economy of Turkey and the GDP, and therefore not holding those municipalities really is a blow to the kleptocratic elements of the AK Party regime, because it denies them the ability to essentially collect rents from control of municipal government.
So, Ambassador, maybe I could ask you to dive a little more into this analysis of perhaps the failure of Erdogan's project and his desire to try to maybe obscure the centenary a little bit, because even though he might have been leading a counter revolution, as you called it, he did talk frequently in the past about 2023 as an important date for him. Right. I mean, he made sure to be in office as president in 2023. He often referred to, the term you used, a new Turkey. I think he used the term a 100-year ellipsis a lot to suggest that in 2023 there'd be something new born on the centenary. I mean, he clearly had, based on past rhetoric, big plans for something around this date. So sort of, can you describe for us what happened that he would maybe now play those down?
Well, I think, the point, I think, and I really would defer to Alan on this, who has followed this for far longer than I have, but I think Erdogan had aspirations when he started to transform Turkish, society, but Turkish society has remained stubbornly divided, and a very large part of the population remains strongly committed to the Ataturk principles. He did win the most recent presidential election. I think the opposition is now, as we speak, is sort of licking its wounds, and at least the CHP is looking shortly to conference in Ankara that will, decide whether Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the head of the party who failed to unseat Erdogan in the presidential election, will be replaced. But, it still is roughly a 50-50 country. And in that sense, he's been unable to completely extirpate the nation's commitment to secularism. And I think that's a source of frustration to him.
Yeah. Alan, can you give us any more details on sort of what the new Turkey project was?
I mean, there was a point when he was talking about Turkey 2023 as the 100th anniversary, as a time when a great Turkey would emerge, and Turkey would be one of the top 10 economies in the world. I believe he announced that. I think it was in 2013 that he announced that. But I may be wrong on that date, and a number of other accomplishments that were supposed to have happened in 2023 that Turkey obviously has fallen woefully short of. So that may be one reason why he wanted to play it down. Eric raises an interesting point. What if October 7th hadn't happened? I do think there were stories out there that the diplomatic community in Ankara was already puzzled why even before October 7th, why they weren't receiving invitations to some big event for October 29th. So I think he did already plan to play it down. And the reason you give Blaze, that you suggest, I think by your question, that Turkey had failed to meet the lofty goals he set for it, certainly could be the explanation, part of the explanation for that. But I do think it's primarily what Eric was talking about, the counter-revolutionary aspect of it. And in particular, I think one thing we have to give him credit for on that score that October 7th punctuates is that Erdogan, to a great extent, has succeeded in Turkey, it seems to me, of making Hamas the equivalent of the Palestinian issue. And after this horrendous terrorist action, virtually no politician in Turkey called it terrorism. There were two exceptions that I know of. Auctioneer did refer to it, the head of the party, the right of center opposition party, did refer to it as terrorism, but a couple of days later, she called Netanyahu the Hitler of the 21st century, and all her rhetoric turned viciously anti-Israel. And the Ozgur Özel, the politician who was trying to win the leadership against the incumbent of the Republican People's Party, did also use the term terrorism almost embarrassedly in the midst of blaming Israel for the problem. He did say, of course, it doesn't mean we support Hamas terrorism, but basically all across the spectrum, including the leader of the Republican People's Party, nobody condemned Hamas, nobody called for terrorism, with these two minor exceptions.
And I would say in that sense, where Erdogan has fallen short clearly is in economic management. I mean, he had, 10 pretty good years, largely based on essentially adopting the economic program of his predecessors, and particularly of the late Kemal Dervish. He rode to electoral victory on the basis of, some very good economic years as a result. But in more recent years, his personal mismanagement of the economy, which has saddled Turkey with, extraordinarily high inflation, and persistent, current account deficit that is always verging on crisis, I think has undermined, some of his plans for this, for Turkey emerging as, a Muslim superpower or regional superpower, as his former prime minister, now opponent, described it, back a number of years ago, Prime Minister Davutoglu.
And to your point, Alan, it's sort of striking that no one in Turkey would use the term terrorism, since that is a common critique that Erdogan levies against the rest of the world, is not recognizing terrorism against Turkey and not being quick enough to use that term. So that's somewhat poignant there. But that being said, about sort of the embrace of Hamas as the face of the Palestinian issue, Turkey nevertheless did kick Hamas leadership out of Turkey at sort of an early point in all of this. What are we to make of that? Was that just a brief moment of weakness, or was that sort of something that you think they might go back on? How should we interpret that action?
Do you want me to?
Sure, go ahead, Alan.
I mean, on October 7th, a picture went viral of Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, at a victory prayer service, which reportedly was taking place in Turkey. I think it's one thing for Erdogan to rhetorically defend Hamas. It's another thing to have the leadership of Hamas sitting in Turkey on the day of one of the largest terrorist actions that have taken place in modern history. So I think that was probably a source of embarrassment if these reports are true, and I don't know if they've been fully confirmed. I think the Turks did not confirm them. I think they denied them. I can understand that he asked Hania and company to find someplace else to celebrate. But he did speak with Hania on the phone later on. And, I think this was something very temporary.
I agree. I think it was totally tactical. I think we have to go back and look at since 2006 when Hamas won elections in Gaza after the Israeli withdrawal in 2005, and then particularly after Hamas executed a coup in 2007 in Gaza, which involved, among other things, throwing representatives of the Palestinian Authority who had been in place off the roofs of buildings in Gaza. Turkey proved to be a supporter of Hamas. I mean, they welcomed Khalid Mashal and Ismail Haniyeh to Istanbul. They had official government meetings with them. They provided support, including in 2010, the infamous Mavi Marmara support mission that was intercepted by Israel and ended up in a shootout with the Israeli Defense Forces. So this is a long old story of Turkish support. My view was this was not an expulsion of Hamas leaders from Istanbul, although they're can easily repair to the luxurious Ritz-Carlton in Doha, where they have alternate homes and places to do their work. I think this was part of Erdogan's balancing act. He gets away with, as Alan was saying, it's pretty remarkable that the kind of rhetoric which we would find intolerable from adversaries, we have learned to live with from Recep Tayyip Erdogan, because he has successfully for years convinced American policymakers that Turkey and he are too big to fail, and that we need them more than they need us. I personally have argued publicly and lengthily that that's not true, that Turkey needs us at least as much as we need them, maybe more. But we're unwilling to play those cards, in part because we do need Turkey for a variety of things, including getting Sweden across the finish line into NATO, which is very, very important in the context of the largest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Turkey also plays obviously an important role in the North Caucasus, in places like Nagorno-Karabakh, where its support for the Aliyev regime in Azerbaijan has been really decisive, I would say, on the battlefield. But in Syria, in Libya, and potentially in negotiations with Ukraine, I mean, Turkey is the venue for ongoing contacts between Ukraine and Russia over, mostly right now, over prisoner swaps, but potentially, over some kind of negotiated settlement if we ever get to that point. And so the administration, I think, has been willing to give Turkey a much longer leash than I would personally. But I think part of that is Erdogan, while he can run his mouth, does have to be a little bit careful. And I think he just basically said, get out of Dodge to Hania until things cool down a little bit.
So I want to get to the question of sort of the U.S. reaction.
Alan,
Yeah, in just a second, but Alan, go ahead.
Go ahead, Blaise. That's fine.
Well, I was just going to ask in the list of things that Turkey might be useful for that you just gave, Ambassador Edelman, you didn't mention their role in potentially negotiating the release of hostages held by Hamas, which is something that they have sort of repeatedly tried to suggest that they are prepared or capable of doing. And yet no one seems to be taking them up on that offer. So just wanted to get your thoughts on whether that is something they could in fact do. But Alan,
Well, I'll give you my take on it, and then Alan can revise and extend my remarks if he wants. I mean, I think the Turks are trying to insert themselves into this because they have had contacts with Hamas, obviously with Hania and Mashal, as I mentioned earlier. But it's pretty clear that Qatar, with whom they have a close relationship also, and in fact, Turkish troops, as far as I know, are still deployed in Qatar. It's still the Qataris who really are the primary interlocutors here. Whether the Turks could play some facilitating role or not, I think, remains to be seen. But I think this is more performative right now than actual.
Yeah.
Alan, your thoughts?
I was going to say something about that. I've just reinforced what Eric has to say. In discussing the initial reaction, I can't recall if I mentioned Erdogan did say that he wanted Turkey to mediate. But the reality is Turkey has never shown itself to have real influence over Hamas. I can't think of one time when they were really helpful in a ceasefire and at least to public awareness. And I recall in the past, the Israelis specifically saying they did not want Turkey, and at that time, Qatar involved, and usually Egypt has been the mediator. Now, as Qatar has been more financially involved, Qatar is obviously playing a role, but Turkey seems totally shut out. And I think this was signified by the fact that when Blinken made his first trip to the region, he didn't stop in Turkey, which upset the Turks quite a bit and somewhat may account for some of the more heated anti-US rhetoric. And also on this trip, at least according to what I've seen of State Department statements, he is not scheduled to go to Turkey, but Turks have put out the word that he is coming to Turkey on Sunday. So the Turks have, under Erdogan, sometimes tried to force a visit to happen by saying that it is scheduled to happen. Hasn't always worked. I don't know. I doubt that Blinken
or to say that Erdogan is going to have meetings with Biden that haven't been
exactly scheduled. That's really what I had in mind. Yeah, exactly that. And I doubt Blinken is going there, but the word the Turks put out is that he'll be there on Sunday. We'll see. But I would say in general, the U.S. has ignored Turkey's offer to mediate. Now, that said, look, if Turkey could somehow arrange for release of hostages, everybody, I think would dance a jig over that. But nothing in the history of Turkey's relations with Hamas suggests that Turkey would be able to pull that off.
I agree.
So, absent potentially pulling a rabbit out of the hat with the hostages, where does Turkey's relationship with Israel go now? I mean, at moments, Hamas has been sort of the critical factor in that relationship, most significantly after the 2010 Mavi Marmara incident that you mentioned, Ambassador Edelman. But in the most recent rapprochement between them and restoration of ties, I guess it was 2 years ago now, so sort of Israel largely ignored the fact that Hamas was present in Turkey and that didn't make sort of Turkey kicking out Hamas leadership a requirement for those relations to be restored. I guess, was that a mistake, or does that mean that this relationship could be repaired again at some point in the future? Or is this a more definitive break than what we've seen in the past?
Look, I wouldn't say it's a definitive break. Nations always have reasons to want to try and engage with one another, and there's lots of potential reasons why Turkey and Israel would want to do some business together. I do think, however, Israeli officials for the last 20 years have tended to underestimate the degree to which Erdogan's rhetoric is. I think they have a tendency to just say, he's just saying this is all for domestic consumption. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just blah, blah, blah.
Is it
So
just Israeli officials that have a tendency to think that way?
American officials too, but Israeli officials in particular, in part, I think, because for many, many years, back before, not just the Abraham Accords, but back before the peace treaty with Egypt and the peace treaty with Jordan, Turkey was really the only Muslim country with which Israel had, a kind of normal, decent, relationship. In the 90s, that actually, broadened into a kind of strategic partnership, in part because they had a common enemy in Syria, and the role Syria at that point was playing in hosting the leadership of the PKK, notably including now incarcerated Abdullah Öcalan, who I like to point out was delivered to Turkish security officials, trussed up pretty much like a Christmas turkey, thanks to the work of U.S. intelligence agencies. But that all began to sour very much when Erdogan and the AKP came to power. There were problems even before that, but they certainly put the relationship into a very negative trajectory, culminating with the Mavi Marmara and kind of break in relations. Interestingly, in the last few years, Erdogan has tried to improve relations, in part because his policies had essentially isolated Turkey, everywhere in the region. I mean, it started out under Ahmet Davutoglu of a policy of no problems with neighbors, and about 4 or 5 years ago, Turkey had nothing but problems with its neighbors, including problems with neighbors with whom the relationship had been more or less stable for a while, like Greece. I think there was obviously a lot of interest in Israel in getting back to a normal relationship, and I think a willingness to say, okay, well, whatever time he shoots his mouth off about this, that, or the other thing, we can we can put that to one side. I do think that what's happened now is going to be at least a punctuation point in the relationship, if not a break. And you've already seen Israel withdraw most, if not all, of its diplomats from Turkey in light of the violent rhetoric and the big pro-Palestine rally. And I think it'll be a while before this, can move back in the direction of any kind of normalization of relations. I think the shock of what happened on the 7th of October in Israel, which is hard to, I think, underestimate because of the loss of life, because of the barbarity, because of the visibility of it, and then the sort of the nature of the Erdogan and other Turks' rhetoric on this, I think, is really going to reverberate for a long time in Israel. It will be a while before Israelis, I think, will get over this and be interested in sort of normalization of some kind. I would just add, one of the things that Erdogan has accomplished, we talked about his failures, but one of the things he has accomplished, although I think it's a negative accomplishment, is to change the nature of political discourse in Turkey to the point, as Alan was saying earlier, that across the board, you now see this sort of violent anti-Israel rhetoric, this, pro-Hamas, stance that you would not have seen necessarily 20 years ago. And that is, something of, a marker for how much he has controlled the media environment and how much he has shifted the way discourse in Turkey goes.
Your
Yeah.
thoughts, Alan,
Yeah, sure.
on the Israel relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly, just on Eric's last point, it's particularly interesting when one considers, if you look at Pew Research polls from early in this century, when they used to survey major Muslim countries on a variety of issues, they often asked approve, disapprove about various groups. And invariably on these polls, you found Turks strongly disapproving of Hamas. So I think he really has changed the spectrum and changed attitudes towards Hamas. And I see it in many ways as equating Hamas with the Palestinian issue. So yes, just on Israel-Turkish relations, it is interesting to me that unlike what happened in 2018, when that normalization ended with the recall of ambassadors, this one is a little different. First of all, when Israel withdrew its diplomatic personnel, they made clear that they were doing it for security reasons, not that they were not trying to break ties. Because of security, that is, because of the major demonstrations that were taking place at Israeli diplomatic posts in Turkey, in Istanbul and Ankara. And Turkey has not withdrawn its ambassador in Tel Aviv. Nor has Israel asked it to. Commercial trade has, through all these crises over the years, has remained very high. I think last year that Turkey was actually the number 5 country importer for Israel. That is, that Israel, it was number 5 on the list of countries from which Israel imported. I see there is some effort to boycott Turkish tomatoes. I don't know how big a part that, how much that affects the $7 billion worth of exports Turkey sends to Israel. But, you know, so I think that does reflect some anger, but there does seem to be a sense that we don't want to totally cut things this time. And just to put it further in the perspective that Eric was talking about, Turkey had tried to come out of these difficulties it had with its neighbors for economic reasons, in order both to earn investments from the Gulf, but also to send the message to Western investors, who constitute the overwhelming percentage of Turkey's investors, that it's a good place, it's a good citizen. It's not an unstable country. And I think that partly explains why Erdogan, if the reports are true, that Erdogan did not want Hania doing his victory dance in Turkey. And I think it partly explains why Turkey has not recalled its ambassador. And for Israel, they're not looking to make the fight any worse than it already is, because they've got enough problems on their hands. But, you know, there's no telling where it'll go from here. But so far,
willing to predict right now, you can hold me to this, that it's going to get worse before it gets better.
well, it probably will. Yes.
Um,
I'm not sure. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah. That's
on the tomato boycott, Alan, I'd be curious what your take is on this. As you recall, when Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet, one of the steps that Putin took, which was very effective with Turkey, was a boycott of tomato imports. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether Israelis, particularly since there are a lot of Israelis who, have hail from Russia, recent immigrants who hail from Russia and are undoubtedly aware of all that, whether that somehow is playing into that decision.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know if agricultural imports are quite as big a percentage for Israel as they were for Russia, but that certainly could be a factor.
But if the Turkish-Israeli relationship is on the rocks, it seems that the Turks are being at least friendlier towards their frenemy or competitor, or I don't know how you would describe Tehran. But we've had the Iranian foreign minister visiting Turkey during all of this. And speaking of boycotts, it was in Turkey that he raised the idea of an Islamic boycott of Israel. Where do we see that relationship heading as a result of this conflict?
Well, I don't think Turkey is ready to join the axis of resistance. But it certainly was noteworthy that this week they hosted the Taliban foreign minister and the Iranian foreign minister, and that the Iranian foreign minister used Turkey as its platform to say that the resistance might have another surprise act in store for Israel if Israel doesn't cease its operations in Gaza. Not aware that any Turkish official contradicted him on that. I think what Iran and Turkey do share in common is a desire to see a diminished U.S. presence in the region. And that's where the overlap of interests is. These countries don't love one another, but they have always been respectful rivals going back decades. And I think they do share, certainly with as Erdogan has evolved in recent years with strategic autonomy, seemingly the major goal of Turkish foreign policy. Yeah, there is that overlap regarding the U.S. presence.
Speaking of the United States, I just wanted to ask both of you about sort of U.S. policy options here before I turn it over to the audience for any questions that they may have, which they can write in through the Q&A chat feature. But Ambassador Edelman, you mentioned sort of the long list of reasons why the United States might feel that Turkey is too big to fail, including the need for Sweden's accession into NATO. And it was striking to me that Erdogan finally sent Swedish accession to the Turkish parliament, sort of in the midst of both his anti-Israel and anti-US rhetoric, which seems to be a cynical ploy in recognition of the fact that we're very wary of perhaps angering him as long as he still holds Sweden's fate in his hands. But is there anything the U.S. can or should be doing to try to get Erdogan to be a more responsible actor and to be a better ally in all of this, or are we sort of without any significant leverage?
No, we have more significant leverage. I think we're frequently unwilling to use it. Look, Erdogan responds to to leverage. I mean, he did that, as we were indicating earlier, in the context of the relationship with Russia after the shoot down of the Russian fighter jet back a number of years ago. So he responds, to that. I would note that when President Trump said that unless some Americans who were being held hostage, essentially by the Turkish state, were released, he would slap enormous tariffs on Turkey, and within a few days those people were released. So I think we can play kind of hardball with Turkey. I think we're inclined not to do it because that's not the way we normally deal with allies. And I think for a very long time, people have continued to believe that, well, if we just treat Turkey like an ally, they'll behave like one. But I think the reality is that 20 years now of evidence of this AK Party government is that doesn't work. That you just have to be, I would say, ruthlessly transactional about this. And I think we're not all that willing to do it. There are some issues, by the way where the administration doesn't completely control things. And so, I think there were a lot of, um, Turks who were doing a happy dance when Senator Robert Menendez, the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was indicted and had to step aside from his chairmanship since he was the major obstacle in the United States Congress to the F-16 sale that the Turks very much want to go through from happening. And although I don't know that he and Senator Cardin differ that much on the merits of the issue, certainly Senator Cardin is a much more mild-mannered person than Senator Menendez, and much less likely to kind of obstruct the administration from pursuing its policy. However, I don't know how he is going to react since he's a staunch supporter of Israel. I don't know how he's going to react, to this rhetoric of Erdogan's, and whether that'll have an impact on the F-16 sale. I suspect it will.
Is the Alan, over to you, but let me just ask this: is the F-16 sale still a point of leverage? It's not something that has been moving forward. So is it something that Erdogan has just sort of assumed isn't going to happen, or is it something that we can still use to try to change Turkish behavior?
Well, I defer to Alan because he has forgotten more about how the arms sales process to Turkey works than I've ever known. But I will say this: I don't think there's any chance in hell of it moving forward until Sweden has been approved and the modified North Atlantic Treaty is ratified by the Turkish Grand National Assembly. Until that happens, I think there will be a huge suspicion that Erdogan is just the bargaining is continuing, that we're still in the souk and we're bargaining over the price of the rug, and I think there'll be a real disposition not to not to move forward with that until they see signed, sealed, and delivered instruments of ratification being deposited.
First of all, regarding the arms sale process, whatever I know is probably a thimble's worth compared with Eric, who among the many feathers in his cap was also the number 3 at the Pentagon. So I think he does a fair amount. But on this issue, there was supposed to be a deal in the works at Vilnius, where Turkey was supposed to agree to Sweden, and we were supposed to then come forward with the F-16s, and supposedly there were F-35s for Greece that were also supposed to be, that reportedly were part of the deal. And it was interesting, a week before Vilnius, Senator Menendez actually said he's thinking of changing his position and agreeing to the F-16s. And he was asked, well, when do you think you might decide? He said, oh, maybe in about a week. And that never happened. Something fell apart at Vilnius. And I don't know if Erdogan still thinks it's possible for him to get F-16s. They should be a point of leverage. Turkey needs them. But perhaps he's given up on them. He certainly knows he's not going to get them, as Eric said, without ratification of Sweden, which, by the way, he promised at Vilnius would happen in October, and that has not happened. We're into November already, and the chairman of the Turkey's Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee actually indicated the other day it's not an urgent matter for him. Erdogan may calculate that even if he ratifies Sweden, he's not going to get it. So I don't know. It certainly should be a point of leverage. And I agree with Eric that, with Cardin is a different guy than Menendez. He puts down similar conditions beyond ratification of Sweden. But from everything I hear, those other conditions can be finessed much more easily with him there than they could have been with Menendez. So I think the F-16s are still out there waiting for Erdogan. Let me just, if I could just quickly on the issue of leverage. I know you want to get to audience Q&A, but I'm not sure how many people noticed that the House of Representatives passed a bill yesterday that would put sanctions on entities that provide financial, technical, and other types of support to Hamas. The bill passed overwhelmingly. I think it was 363 to 46, something like that, and it goes to the Senate now. I don't know what its fate will be there. Given the context of the times, though, I would assume they will take a good look at it. It does have a waiver in it, but it's certainly something that I would assume is going to get Turkey's attention.
And of course, that comes right on the heels of Treasury designating a number of Turkish entities for facilitating trade in electronic and high-tech goods to Russia in violation of sanctions, which pointedly Turkey has not aligned itself with, pretty much alone of all the NATO countries.
Generally, it seems to me, Eric, we basically have taken a turn the other cheek approach to Erdogan's rhetoric. I see Kirby was asked about it. He said, look, our ships are out there to deter a widening of the war, full stop. He didn't want to address directly what Erdogan had said about us there to cause massacres. And other heated rhetoric, it seems to me, from Erdogan, we've ignored.
Absolutely. And I think that's a mistake.
I do too. I stand in second place to, I know we're not supposed to be talking domestic politics here, but I think anyone who knows me knows that I'm no fan of Donald Trump. But you are right, Eric, and I know you're not a fan of Donald Trump also. You are right that the action that he took on Brunson, when he put sanctions on Turkey temporarily, I think he doubled the tariffs on aluminum and steel, which are key exports from Turkey to the U.S., is what really led him to release Brunson. And in a way, the Turkish economy has never fully recovered from those sanctions. So yes, I think the U.S. as a general point, as a general principle, has quite a bit of leverage on Turkey.
Not to put too fine a point on it, after the presidential election, which he won, Erdogan did appoint a new economic team that was meant to try and deal with the incredible damage his personal management of the economy has done to Turkey, And I see they've gotten inflation down to 65%, which is actually, a significant reduction from, the 80% it was a couple of months ago. And part of the, Minister Shimshek and the new central bank chief were all there to try and encourage foreign domestic investment, which had been fleeing Turkey in part because of his economic mismanagement. And there's also his mercurial nature and the lack of rule of law and a lot of other things. But, the day after the rally, which, I think someone in the chat has pointed out was not just a Palestine rally, it was as a Hamas rally, as Alan noted. The lira dropped by 7%, like a rock, because the markets were so skittish about a foreign capital leaving as a result of the overheated rhetoric. These are things that we can use, as leverage. We know that Erdogan has said he doesn't want to ever go to the IMF. He's probably going to have to, and we have some say about what, how much and what conditions the IMF will, provide to Turkey, and this is the kind of thing we should be using. We use with other countries, but for some reason we've never really used with Turkey.
Yeah, I just maybe just one more point on that. We talked about Ismail Hania, and also Salah Harouri, another senior Hamas official on the supposedly on the military planning side. They come and go to Turkey quite often, and they're on our specially designated terrorist list. I think it's Harouri who actually has a $5 million bounty on his head, if I'm not mistaken. And there's.
And he's believed to be involved in the planning for October 7th.
October 7th. I mean, honest men can disagree whether the U.S. should get into a rhetorical tit for tat with Erdogan about, on each and every statement. But when it comes to hosting people who are on our terrorist list, I think that really is a clear cause for us to take some kind of punitive action.
Just as a slight pushback to that, and to get your closing thoughts, we do have sanctions in place on Turkey as a result of its purchase of the S-400 Russian missile defense system under the CATSA bill. And those sanctions
that was imposed, Blaze, essentially by the Congress over a very reluctant president.
So one point would be to say there is a model for if Congress wants sanctions on how to do it in a way that is necessary. But the other point is those sanctions haven't really brought any sort of resolution to the S-400 issue or changed Turkish behavior. Is the lesson learned from them that they're not strong enough, not punitive enough, not hitting the right nerve points in the Turkish economy?
Well, I would say two things. One, it came late in the process. Long after the purchase had been made, money had been exchanged, et cetera. Had the sanctions been imposed earlier in the S-400 purchase process, it might have had a different kind of impact. And secondly, we have not imposed the most painful sanctions. CATSA has a whole menu of sanctions. And the most painful ones, which have to do with some of the things I was talking about earlier, support in the international financial institutions, and also cutting off Turkey from access to U.S. defense goods and services, have not been imposed. But it might be good to rattle their cage a little bit, or I'm using a mixed metaphor here, or rattle that saber over their heads, to make them understand that the U.S. is willing to do it. But what they've seen is administration after administration unwilling and fighting the Congress over these sanctions, rather than saying, as they could, if it were me, to let me run the zoo, I would use the Congress as the bad cop and say, if you don't help us on X, Y, or Z issue, this is what these people in the Congress are going to impose on you. And that's, traditionally something that administrations have done with other countries when it comes to the issues of sanctions. We just have never done that with Turkey.
Alan, any closing thoughts in 30 seconds?
I would say that the most effective sanctions have been the economic ones. And I'll just underscore again, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, and this did not justify him in my eyes. But I think we do have to take a lesson that when he put sanctions on Turkish exports, it raised tariffs, did some other sanctions, it got results. And the S-400 is a special case. And it hasn't brought Turkey around. I think that's a long discussion. But we also have to remember this was the blunder of the century for Erdogan. By buying those S-400s, he lost 100 F-35s, and he lost Turkey's participation in the F-35 co-production program, when supposedly his great goal is to develop autonomy in his military industry. So. And
a defense industrial base that's capable of exporting.
Indeed. I'm sorry for talking too long. We didn't get to audience questions. My apologies. My role in that.
No, thank you both for your very knowledgeable responses and for your time this afternoon. Very much appreciate it. Thank you to the audience who tuned in. As always, you can find more analysis and up-to-date reporting of what's going on in the war in Israel at JINSA.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. Alan, Ambassador Edelman, thank you for your time. I hope everyone has a good weekend.
Thank you, Blaze.
Shalom.